Hi, and welcome to the first ever BREB class. We are coming live to you from the Catskills in upstate New York. I am your host and teacher, Sandy Allen. I'm an author and a writer and a speaker and a reporter, and also I bake a lot of bread. And especially for the last few years since I moved to the middle of nowhere, where I was dissatisfied with the bread that was available to me, I got really into making my own sourdough bread. So recently, as you've maybe noticed, everyone on earth has become interested in baking bread at home. And I've felt a lot of desire to share what I've learned over the last few years as I've gotten into my own bread habit with more people. And so I've been texting with a lot of people and messaging with people and doing conversations on Instagram with people, and now here we are. We're going to do an actual class together. I could not be more excited. And I want to start today with a few of the, I think, most basic aspects of being a bread baker. So we're going to look at how to feed the starter, and we're going to look at how to mix a bread. So that will be what we cover today. At the end of the session today, we'll have some time for Q&A. So if you have questions, you can feel free to post them in the chat as we're going. My producer slash best friend slash roommate slash husband, Rob Dubbin, is standing by fielding your questions, and he'll be sharing them with me. And we will have a proper Q&A period at the end of the hour. So if I don't answer your question as I'm going, I'll try to answer it at the end. And if I don't get to your question this time, well, we'll have to do this again. All right. Thank you so much to those of you who've showed up already. I'm going to vamp a little bit here in case there are a couple of other people who want to join us before I dive into the action. But yeah, I first off just wanted to tell you a little bit about like who I am as a baker and what my philosophy is about all this stuff. I think like with everything that I do in my life, whether it's studying writing or studying wine or studying schizophrenia, which is what my book is about, I've always been attracted to looking at really complicated topics, seemingly complicated topics, and then bringing them into a form that feels more approachable, or bringing them into more of that kind of common language. And I think bread is a great example of something that is simultaneously basic, old, ancient, like simple, you know, almost too simple. And then on the other hand, especially like now, the way that the internet is, especially like when I was first getting into bread, I mean, there was more opinion out there. There was more crap I could get like technically weeded about. And it was so hard for me to find somewhere to learn about bread that felt like simple and honest and human, and like it didn't assume that I was really good at math. I'm actually really bad at math, and it's one of the things about baking I've always found most intimidating. So I tend to be a baker who I understand that it's important to be precise. I understand that we want to be measuring our ingredients, but I'm also not very interested in talking about bread in such a way that, oh, you're just showing how smart you are and you're showing that you have an engineering degree, blah, okay? I'm not into that stuff. This is not a place for me to show you how much I know. This is a place for us to come together, talk about some of the skills that we have, talk about some of what's going on in the mixing bowl inside the oven, and hopefully together we'll learn. And my hope is that you can help me learn how to teach this class. So if you have questions, if I'm doing something and you're like, what's going on? Ask. And if you are in your own baking practice running into something and you really want to ask the question, yeah, share it in the chat. Rob will hopefully share it with me, and hopefully I'll get it to by the end of the class, I'll get to everybody's questions. So I'm going to launch in here and talk a little bit about the starter. I am from Northern California, which is specifically West Marin, where tartine started and where like a lot of really good bread comes from, Northern California / the Bay Area. So I grew up in a world where like good bread was just around, and I had no idea that it was sort of elsewhere perceived as kind of like fancy or hard to come by. And I remember when I first moved across the country to the East Coast when I was 18, I walked around going, where is the sourdough? Like, where is bread? I was so confused. Legitimate, in hindsight, kind of sad, Bay Area transport, transplant being confused about the lack of sourdough. I was genuinely confused. And I think there's this really big kind of gap. There's this big there's two kinds of bread in our world. On the one hand, there's all the bread that's made with commercial yeast, right? So right now you're hearing about this a lot. You're hearing about the fact that stores are running out of yeast. So commercial yeast, all the bread that you would buy at your supermarket that's in a plastic bag that, came from a big brand, or you've seen it advertised on TV, or, the squares are very perfect and all that. Those are usually made with industrial or commercialized yeast. Okay. So those are or commercial yeast. So those are going to be, that's not what we're dealing with in this class. We're going to be dealing more with sourdough. And so sourdough is made with a starter. So that's the fundamental difference there, is that you have basically yeast that have been through a process, they've been made into something that'll work faster and is kind of in this freeze-dried animated state, and it'll kind of come to life and make bread really quickly. And that's really useful if you're in a big commercial bakery or you're trying to make a ton of bread. But especially if you're at home and you're just an individual person, especially if your bodega or your supermarket is totally out of yeast. The great news is that you can cultivate a sourdough starter right at your own home. So my sourdough starter, I have it labeled here, important goo, because it is very important goo. And when I leave home, like in the before times when I used to leave home, I had a section in my kind of document to friends who are staying at the house about how to take care of the sourdough starter, because the sourdough starter is a member of our family. It's a big part of life around here. So my sourdough starter, I manifested it. I began to manifest it the first day of the year, 2018. And I will always remember that date because at that time, I was about 3 weeks away from my first book publishing, and I was terrified. I was like fully terrified. So I had this idea that after my whole adult life, living away from the Bay Area, I finally wanted to get that really good bread back in my life. And I was like, I'm going to do it. I'm going to start making sourdough. I was really intimidated by it. I remember being like, this is going to be hard. I'm never going to do it well. But I started my starter, and eventually over time, I started to make not just good bread, but like really good bread, like really good bread. I was so happy with the bread. So that's been my journey, going from no bread to really good bread. And the fun thing about the starter is, as I said, I just manifested it here. All it takes to make a starter initially is flour and water. And then what you're going to do every day is you're going to kill or take away, discard most of that, replace it with more flour and water. And you're going to do the same thing the next day and the same thing the next day. And over time, what you're going to do is you're going to train a culture that will, well, it has a specific goal in life. Its goal is to eat flour and water, because that's what you've encouraged. You've said, hey, here's this fabulous meal of flour and water, and the little microorganisms went, ooh, flour and water, I love that kind of thing. And then you're like, and then you killed 80% of their society. And then you come in the next day and you're like, hey, sorry about that. I just killed 80% of your society, but here is flour and water. And the microorganisms go, fabulous. We love flour and water. And so you're training that culture every day as you feed it. And over time, that culture is going to start to get really good at producing air, which is what you want, right? Because that's the magic of bread. We're taking flour and water, we're putting it in the oven, and it's going to rise. It's going to have that magic to it. And that's all the culture. And you kill them as you bake them. So here inside my jar of important goo, I'm going to first discard most of what's in here. So I'm going to go back to my little fridge where I have my jar that I use for discard. So there's my jar. I'll be right back with the discard container. So here's this. And what I'll do first is just dump out most of what's in here. Okay, so you can see actually on the top here, there's like alcohol is another of the byproducts of the microorganisms as they eat. And so you can just pour that alcohol off. We're not interested in that because we're making bread, not beer. But it's fun that the same microorganism is is here making both a leaven for bread and alcohol for those who want it. So you can pour off that alcohol. I do keep this discard around. I keep it in a container in the fridge. I do not close it all the way. If you close it all the way, it will start to grow all sorts of microorganisms that you don't want in your food. So leave it a little bit open. And then what I do with this discard, because you know it really can accumulate if you're feeding your starter every day. So what I do with this discard is I make waffles, pancakes, English muffins, banana bread, other such wonders. This is powerful stuff. So if you keep it, you can also just fry it up. Pink had a fiasco this week trying to fry up discard, but you can do it. But yeah, so keep that discard around. You can make waffles. Personally, I favor waffles, banana pancakes as well. So now I've discarded. What next? I'm going to replace that flour and water that I just got rid of with more flour and water. So my starter eats 50-50 whole wheat and bread flour. That's its favorite food. What's your favorite food? Maybe it's 50-50 whole wheat bread flour, like my starter. So I'm going to add a little bit of that. And this is not precise. You've maybe noticed that. What we're going to try to do is get it to the consistency of pancake batter. So now I'm going to add a little bit of filtered water. Add that water. And I'm going to mix it around. And we want it to get to like a pancake batter consistency. So right now I'd say that's a little thin. I'm going to add a little more flour. Isn't this so thrilling? Mixing flour and water on live TV. This is TV, right? All right, so maybe you can see that there. We got that nice kind of pancake batter consistency. I've mixed it up real good, got all those lumps out, and voila, we've fed our starter. Okay, so my starter will now eat, and I will repeat the exact same process tomorrow. And then, you do that every single day, you have a happy starter. So now our starter is going to have a little meal. And if you have your starter in a more vertical container, like a ball jar or anything like that, you can actually take a rubber band and put it around right at the level of where you fed it. And then you can watch, because over the next few hours, it's going to rise up and then it'll fall down again. And so that's one of those ways you can tell that your starter is happy and healthy, is if it does that rise and then it settles down. And you can actually, if you're someone who's, olfactory, you can smell it too, because as it's eating, it'll smell really yeasty, and then it'll start to smell more sour. So that will be kind of that, that process. And you can kind of notice every day your starter will go through that little cycle if you're feeding it. This is a little philosophical, but personally, one of the reasons I love feeding a starter is that it is you gotta do this every day thing. And I think for those of us who have difficulty being on this earth, and which of us does not have difficulty being on this earth, there's, I think, something nice to things like houseplants and feeding a starter, that it's a rhythm. I wake up every day, I do certain things, and it includes taking care of this little bowl of goo for a few minutes. And then in return, this little bowl of goo gives me wonderful things. All right, I'm gonna put this starter discard back in the fridge. I'm gonna wash my hands, and then we're gonna start mixing our first BREB. Hopefully that was 20 seconds. You can all judge me from before. All right, so when we're mixing a bread, I'm generally doing bread baking by weight. And the reason that I'm going to do it by weight as opposed to like a volume measurement like cups, etc., is because it's a little more precise. And with baking, especially bread baking, precision is kind of, it's a little bit the name of the game, not with feeding the starter, but once we're into the realm of starting to actually make a bread, we do want to be thoughtful about the exact proportions that we're using of stuff. So I used a scale, and I mix my bread in one of these buckets. I find it works well. It makes it pretty easy for when I'm doing all the folding and turning. You can also use a big mixing bowl. So I'll turn on my scale here. And first thing you want to do, of course, is tare it, right? Hopefully you can see that there, Rob. And the first thing I'm going to add to my mixing bowl is some water. And I'm actually realizing there's one step I've sort of skipped here, but I'm going to go grab the water that we're going to use for this bread, and then I'm going to do our float test. And also, if you have comments, put them in the chat, and then Rob is going to show them to me. We have a whole system here. It's very exciting. And yeah, shout out to Rob for masterminding this whole thing tech-wise. It's been absolutely, there is no way I could do this without him caring about tech. Oh, a crumb cake with the discard. That's very exciting. All right, so one thing we're going to do quickly just before I start mixing this bread. So I got up at 5 today, as I do. And I started the levain. I'm probably saying that wrong. I don't speak French. If anyone wants to teach me French, let me know. I'm joking. I just don't have time to learn French. So this is basically, I think of it as like a mega feeding. So you've got your starter. It's used to eating flour, water, flour, water, flour, water. And then you come in and you're like, hey, you like eating flour, water? Have I got a party for you? And you're like, this is the party of the century. You give that more flour, more water than they've ever seen in their lives. They're like, oh, this is amazing. And you're like, yeah, kid, you like that? Wait till you see bread mixing. So this has been eating since 5 a.m. Maybe you can see it. It's kind of, it's got some nice air bubbles in it. Basically, I'm going to do a little test here. Oh, I've got a thing going off. Hold on. Let me go do a quick thing at the oven. I'm actually baking a bread right now, so we can all see it together at the end. All right, so here's our test. This looks ready to me because it's kind of bubbly and stuff, but just to be sure, I've got a little bit of water here, and I've got a little bit of the starter that's been eating the meal of a lifetime, and I'm just gonna drop it in and see if it floats. Not really floating. We're still gonna mix the bread anyway, but what you want, well, it's kind of floating. You want it to be floating. I would actually say if you all weren't sitting here, I'd probably give this another hour before I mixed it. I won't, we'll see. It'll probably still be fine. But that's the test you want to do, called the float test. All right, so I've got my container here. I've got it tared, and then I've got some warmer water, and I'm gonna pour it all over the baking table. I'm gonna get that to about 700 grams. All right, 702, that's kind of close. And now I'm gonna take about 200 grams of starter. And we'll go, we wanted about 200 grams of starter. So now we're at about 900 in there, and we will top that off with bread flour. Good question, Tanya. How often are you baking bread if you're feeding every day? I mean, yeah, so there's kind of a divide here. There's starters that you feed every day and you keep them out on the, at room temperature. And that's going to be if you're baking bread pretty often. And then if you're doing a starter that's living in your fridge and you're feeding it maybe once a week, that's because you're not baking as often. It's really up to you. I bake a few times a week, probably. I don't keep great track of it. Personally, I used to have a fridge starter. It was okay. I liked the bread fine. Home baked bread is delicious. Even fiascos are delicious for the most part with bread, especially during these times. I mean, if you're alone, you're going to enjoy some wonderful baked bread by yourself. If you are with other people, they're probably not going to be complaining. Put some butter on that thing and, dip it in some oil, whatever. Have a nice time. But personally for me, I'd been doing the fridge version of the bread for a while, the fridge starter. After a while, I was like, I kind of want to get even better. And that was when I moved to the starter that lives at room temperature and I feed it every day. So it's really up to you. If you're not going to be baking very often at all, I would suggest probably having a starter that you only feed once a week. Because at the very least, when you're feeding it in a way, you're using flour, right? So if you're thinking about conserving your materials, it's probably smarter to, think about making less bread, and then maybe if you get really into it, you'll want to feed your starter more often. So here we are. We've got 700 grams of water. We've got 200 grams of starter, and I'm going to top it off with another 900 grams of flour to bring us to 1,800 grams. But that's a good question. I think it's really, it's something you can play with too. If you're somebody who thinks, oh, I might not be into bread, and then you start doing it, you might be like, shoot, I really love this, and you want to feed your starter every day. And you want to bake a few times a week. I'm making a mess. I'm always going to bring this up till I'm dead. But one time I went to Ina Garten's house, and one of my favorite things was realizing that she makes a mess when she's like, like all of us, all cooks, I think, make a mess, which is, that's just how it goes. So I spilled a bunch of flour there. So I've got 1,800 grams there, and I'm just going to top that off with another 100 grams of whole wheat flour. All right, 1,900. That'll be our total. Now I'm going to take my hand and I'm going to mix it. Oops. And I think mixing by hand is the easiest. There are tools you can buy. You can try using a spoon, but honestly, mixing by hand is really easiest with this. A lot of baking stuff, it's not easiest to do it by hand. Being very honest, it's kind of really fun. Every time I mix a bread, I'm always like, arr. There's something very, I don't know, almost like elementary school about it, or like preschool about it. It's like you really have to get in there. And what you're trying to do is just make sure you get all those dry pieces incorporated into the dough. It's going to be really tough, hard to work with right now. That's fine. That's what you want. This has lots of time to develop great, generous gluten structure. Right now, it's just about incorporating all that dry in. How much starter did I put in there? So I put in 200 grams of the levain. I use the Tartine Breads recipe. So Tartine Breads, that book, that's what I follow. That's what we're doing. That's what we're going to be doing. Is the flour you're using the same mix as you fed the starter? It is, with the asterisk that it's not the same proportion. So I'm using mostly bread flour in the bread itself and a little bit of whole wheat. And while the bread was young, it got about 50-50, right? Bread flour, whole wheat. So it's the same stuff. I'm just using this plastic scraper to get a little bit of this dough off my hand. And then, so we have now mixed a BREB. That's it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to wash my hands. That's definitely one of the, results of this is you will end up with a very doughy hand. But this is going to sit for 20 minutes, and then we will add the last ingredient, which is salt. All right, so I'm just gonna I'm gonna cover this up and set the timer for about 20 minutes from now, and then we'll add the salt and a little bit of water, and that'll be the last step. The bread will be mixed, and then it'll be the next phase of its life, which is it'll get slowly over time, that gluten will get developed. I'm gonna turn it over the next few hours, and then it'll get shaped, and then it will rest overnight and get baked. So today, well, get baked. Okay. Today we're gonna just stop here. We're gonna have seen this, mixing. I'll add the salt next, and then we'll call it a day, and we'll come back together in future classes, and we'll look at those next phases together. So that's gonna be the actual, stretching and folding, which is what we do in lieu of kneading with this recipe, which is something I really like about it. Kneading is. It's one of those things that I think intimidates people who've never done bread before, rightfully. Like kneading is, it's athletic, it takes skill, it takes, I think, somebody who's spent a lifetime working with dough knows how to knead really well, and somebody who's never touched dough before might be really intimidated to do so. So I think it's really understandable that people are like, I don't want to knead bread, sounds hard. That's one of the things I love about this recipe and other no-knead recipes, which you'll find, the New York Times has a no-knead recipe that uses commercial yeast, if that's what you have on hand, instead of a starter. And that's great. It gives you an opportunity to practice, mixing a bread, doing the stretching and folding, and baking. So now this is going to rest for the next 20 minutes, then we'll add salt. Another question I just got, how many loaves will this make? This will make 2 loaves, which is great. And actually, not only can you make bread with this, but you can turn this into pizza. So when I say 2 loaves, my brain also says it can make 2 loaves of bread or 4 pizzas. And so sometimes I'll have like 1 loaf plus 2 pizzas. So we can have like a loaf of bread for the next day, but I'll have like a pizza for dinner, and I'll save the other pizza dough for 4 days from now, and we'll have a pizza again. It's like the math here can be really fun in terms of what BREB dough will yield. We're still figuring out technically where I should stand in this shot. But these are all great questions. I really appreciate, you all asking me, and I'm going to encourage you in general to, continue to chime in and tell me what's not making sense to you or what you're hung up on. This really is, I think the bulk of what I wanted to get done today is, feeding the starter and then mixing the bread. And so I would say if you have further questions, we can start doing a bit of Q&A. And that's really the kind of what I'd hoped we could kind of get to this phase. And I'll add the salt in 16 minutes. One of the things about this process is it really is... it's a slower process in terms of the amount of time, I will start a bread. The next day I'll start I'll do the levain. The next day I'll do the mix. I'll do the process, the stretch and folds over the next few hours. I'll do the shaping. I'll put it in the fridge overnight. And on day 3, I'll bake. So 3 days will have elapsed on the calendar, and I will finally have bread. So it sounds like it takes a really long time, but the reality is it doesn't take that much of your time. I'll have an alarm set, and I'll have, like right now I have 15 minutes, and then I have to add a little bit of salt mix it through, and then I'm going to walk away for 30 minutes, and then I have to do one step, and then I'm going to walk away for 30 minutes, and I have to do another step. So for me, as somebody where I garden, I do a lot of stuff around the house, I'm a writer, I often have a day that's, got a lot of, I'm up and about doing all sorts of things. Bread folds in really well because I can kind of return to it, walk away, do something else. I love the idea of doing a pizza class. We'll definitely give that a try later. You can all laugh at how I work with pizza dough. I mean, it's tough. But yeah, I think it's one of those things about this recipe that's so fun is once you start getting good bread dough, it can just become pizza. And it's like the best, oh my gosh, it is 7 p.m. and I have not thought at all about what we're going to eat for dinner move is going, wait, I've been making bread all afternoon. This can become pizza now. Why do you add the salt later? That is a good question. There's a fancy baker reason why. I don't know it offhand. There's this thing, autolyzing, ATOLYSE. There's this whole explanation about you mix some of it before you add the salt. I don't know. I just know that I follow the direction on that one. But that's good. I should look into more why exactly it is that you add the salt later. In general, why we add salt to food. I mean, I think it's always worth saying, and this is like, I'm forever indebted to Samin Nosrat and Salt, Fat, Acid, Eat, Heat. And if you've not read that book or watched that show, like it's so fun. And it will teach you so much. But salt helps us taste our food. So I think it's really important that you put salt in your bread. Otherwise, it won't taste like much. And if you ever have bread that you're like, this is really meh, like chances are that's one of the things that could have gone wrong is you forgot to add the salt. Is this the same starter that I started in 2018? Yes. Yes, it is. What's the advantage of, in sourdough starters, if you don't know this, I'm from San Francisco, so for me this is very obvious, but maybe this is not obvious. Sourdough starters can live like centuries. There's, Boudin, one of those bakeries, has a starter that got rescued during the 1906 quake. I mean, it's one of those things where sourdough starters, because it's this culture and you're constantly replenishing it and stuff, it can live as long as it's being well tended to. And I think, you can neglect the heck out of a starter and bring it back to life in a lot of cases. I think it really, it's not what I would advise that you do, but I had a friend who had a starter that was in a fridge for like way too long and was able to bring it back. So, I think that at the end of the day, I would probably just start a new starter if I had one that went really, really, really awry, like it was, growing green slime or something. But for the most part, as long as you're taking good care of your starter, it should live really as long as you do. What's the advantage of a sourdough yeast over commercial yeast? That is a good question. I'm going to answer the reverse question. What's the advantage of commercial yeast? So the advantage of commercial yeast is it's faster, right? So let's say I'm like, oh no, I want to make bread and I've only got a few hours. I would never want to start a sourdough because, as I just said, it can take like 3 days, right? If you're doing it well. And that's because you're giving that culture all this time to eat, all of the and they're having a really nice time, and they're developing all these flavor compounds, and they're processing all that complicated gluten, and they're breaking it down, and they're releasing all this nutrition for you. So that your sourdough starter is just this slow process, right? Whereas a commercial yeast has been basically designed so that commercial yeast can walk in and be like, all right, let's get this done, and it just like eats and it like does its thing, and then boom, you make bread. And so the disadvantages of that, I think there's stuff to be said about, the nutritional disadvantage of commercial yeast. With sourdough, what you get is that nice digestion that's happening. The microorganisms are digesting your gluten for you first, which I think is good. If you want to get really into this, I totally recommend the Michael Pollan episode of his show on Netflix called Cooked, where he bakes bread. He gets really into kind of the differences between commercial yeast and when we say sourdough, what we're really saying is the ancient way. You know what I mean? Like sourdough was the way that you made bread until industrialized yeast only got introduced within the last century plus. It's not that old, right? So the way that we make bread with a sourdough starter is the way that ancient people would have made bread, which is really like you had a little flour and water, it started to bubble, and then from that you started to make bread. So the other advantage of sourdough over commercial yeast specifically right now is, as I said, you can just manifest a starter in your home if you've got a couple of weeks in flour and water. So you don't have to wait until there's commercially, yeast available at your store. But they're basically different processes. I have yeast in my fridge. I use it, if I want to make challah, if I want to make focaccia, there's all kinds of breads that I think you can make quickly and well. And, yeasted rolls. I mean, what a pleasure to have like a homemade yeasted roll, right? So it's not like either or, one is good, one is bad. They have different usages. And I think the sourdough, the benefit of it is it's a really slow process and it yields something that I think is unparalleled in terms of its deliciousness, but also has that advantage of having been kind of pre-digested by microorganisms. And so it's, I think it's got that higher nutritional value. Also requested is apple pie class. Heck yeah. I'm really into pie as well. So yes, we can definitely get into pie on BREB class. So somebody's asking, my sourdough tastes good and rises, but it doesn't have the classic holes. Is that because my starter is fairly new? I only started a month ago. It's hard to know, like, when you say the classic holes. I think what the baker word for this that you'll see is structure, or the crumb. So if you want to like slide down a really particular Instagram hole, you can go on #crumbshot, and there'll be a lot of bakers showing the insides of a lot of their breads. A couple of things could be going on if you're noticing you don't have very good structure with your bread yet. Hopefully, as if you join for future bread classes, and we're going to do the next steps, in coming weeks in terms of the stretch and fold, and then in terms of the shaping. Stretch and fold and shaping are where you're going to be developing all that great structure. So it's possible, for example, that you're not shaping your bread, and that's why it's not actually getting those kind of opportunities to have lots of height to it. It's possible that you're not developing your bread for long enough, like you're not doing that stretch and fold process for enough hours, so the gluten's not getting an opportunity to kind of like really, get into itself and get all elastic and sexy. It's hard to know, not knowing what recipe you're following. It's possible that you're not using bread flour. Right now, like a lot of people don't have the flour that they want on hand, like someone else is asking if they can use 100% rye flour to feed their starter. I know a lot of us are kind of making do with what we can. Can you use 100% rye flour to feed your starter? Sure. Do I know what that will result in? No, I don't think that's really what a starter wants to be eating ideally. And even so, for just to give you a sense, when we make rye bread, if I'm going to make like a full-on rye loaf that we're going to have, Rachel's on, I don't use that much rye flour in that loaf. Like it will still be mostly bread flour, and then it will have some rye flour. Kind of the way that when I mixed this bread, I had mostly bread flour, and then I used some whole wheat. And then with a rye flour or rye bread, you can mix in caraway seeds to get that flavor. So if you make a rye bread from 100% rye flour, and you've, what you'll probably have is a bread that doesn't really stretch, because it's that bread flour that has that higher gluten content, and that's what's going to allow you to have that nice stretchy quality that's going to yield that really kind of like, springy, bouncy, moist, delicious bread. If you have just a whole wheat flour or just rye flour, something like that, it's not going to necessarily be able to stretch as much. It's not going to necessarily have that nice crumb on the inside. So the answer is like, you can do anything, like you can train a starter on whole wheat and see how it goes. Make bread from it. Train a starter on rye, see how it goes. Make bread from it. Can I guarantee it'll work? No, but part of how we find out is you give it a try. So I'm going to go take this bread out of the oven. All right. So just for a little bit of enjoyment at the end of class today, I thought I'd pull this bread out of the oven and share with you, I think, one of the most delightful things about baking BREB which is that not right away, but after a moment here, the bread is going to start to sing to us. So we'll give it a second, and you'll hear what I'm talking about. Oh, someone else is asking about using all-purpose flour for your starter. I think all-purpose flour is definitely going to work better than 100%, whole wheat or 100% rye. All-purpose flour is going to have lower gluten content than bread flour, so it's not going to work quite as well. Give it a go. I think also one of the things to keep in mind is if your starter has only ever tasted rye flour, it'll probably have a better shot at making, bread out of rye flour, if that makes sense. So sort of like what your microorganisms are used to eating, they'll probably have an easier time than making a bigger version of it, or tackling a bigger amount of the same stuff when it comes time. My producer is saying once the bread does start to do its crackle, did you hear it? Headphones recommended for maximum ASMR quality. But yeah, that's one of my favorite things about BREB is it has that, after a moment, a little beautiful song. All right, everybody. I think we're going to wrap up here. It's been such a pleasure joining you all from the comfort of my own kitchen. I hope you learned something today. If you didn't, well, you were already very smart. And I hope you'll join us next time. Please leave, if you have feedback for us, if you have ideas for future classes, if you have stuff you want to know about, if you have questions, etc. Please feel free to chime in. I can answer a couple more questions right now, and hopefully the rest of you can have a lovely rest of your day and enjoy baking bread in your own homes. It's fun. And now we'll go out with the bread playing one of its finest songs, Crackle. All right, everybody. Bye-bye.